from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to start today's program by wishing all of our viewers a Happy New Year's. We hope that 1993 will be most prosperous for you and that you will have a very, very enjoyable year. For the past 11 years, we have taken this opportunity at the beginning of the year to do what we call our New Year's program, and we go back and we review the 12 months that have preceded. And so today it is our pleasure to talk about 1992 and what happened. In order to do that, I'm very pleased to welcome to the program two guests. Both our guests are reporters and also have columns with newspapers. First of all, I welcome to the program D.F. Oliveira, who is with the Spokesman Review and has been with them for many years. And Dave, it's a pleasure to have you on our program.
Pleasure to be here.
And our second guest is David Bond, who's with the Coeur d'Alene Press and the North Idaho News newspapers, and he too has been in that business a long time. And David, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Nice to be here, Tony.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our two regular panelists to assist in the questioning of our guests. First of all, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
To start off the year 1993, let's recap a bit on 1992, and there are some people in the news that we wouldn't even have recognized at the beginning of the year if we'd been sitting here a year ago. Who are the names, Dave, of some of the people who have come to our acquaintance during the past year in the news?
Okay, right off the top, one name just really stands out all by itself, and that's Rodney King. Who would have ever, we would have had no way of suspecting that an incident involving an arrest, a beating would explode into the LA riots. The Spokesman Review has had a link to the Rodney King and the riots afterwards. One of our former interns at our office here in Coeur d'Alene was seriously wounded while trying to cover the LA riots for the Boston Globe. His name is Jeff Kramer. So Rodney King to me is one of the top names.
David, what about you? Can you think of a name that we wouldn't have recognized a year ago, or someone who has risen to prominence during the past year?
Well, I can certainly concur with Dave on Rodney King, and I think that whole episode is going to continue to reverberate in our neck of the woods with the influx of people fleeing what they see as a breakdown of civilization in Southern California. First name that pops to my mind, though, is Ross Perot, other than a few hardcore news junkies who'd followed Perot's escapades around. Probably hadn't heard of him until he was on Larry King Live earlier in the year, and rose from kind of eccentric billionaire cowboy status to capturing, what was it, finally 18% of the public vote. We haven't had a showing like that of a third-party candidate in this country since the Bull Moose Party. Guy came out of nowhere and really, despite his billions, rose to national prominence for free. He took a television media ride to the top. Admittedly, his last few weeks were heavy drains on his cash balance, but here was a guy that was a complete creation of the electronic age.
What about some people who are gone that we wouldn't have anticipated?
I wanted to throw in one other.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to throw in one other that was prominent before, but really came to prominence during the presidential campaign, and that's Murphy Brown. Who would have imagined that? What is it? Art imitating life, or vice versa? Who would have imagined the give and take between the Vice President of the United States and a sitcom actress? That's one, and you can't say Murphy Brown without thinking of the whole episode with her baby. So that's one that really stands out there.
Okay, what about someone who is gone from the scene, who might have been anticipated either through death or else just has sort of disappeared in the power struggle?
That which one?
Let's go
okay,
with Dave first.
Okay, well, we're both Daves. Lyle Alzado comes to mind. He was a prominent football player, starred for the Raiders. I believe he might have played with Denver, but what really He became prominent when he developed a brain tumor as a result of the use of steroids. And just the whole struggle of his last months, seeing this man who used to be the peak of physical prowess deteriorating right in front of your eyes, and some of his reflections just before he died. That was quite a thing.
David Bond?
Well, on an international scale, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to mind. He's still alive, but God knows where. I would have found it difficult to imagine a year and a half ago that the father of glasnost and perestroika and commander of arguably the second or largest military-industrial complex in the world would suddenly be clipping coupons and at this taping anyway, pretty much in disfavor with the people he liberated. He's just gone. We don't deal with him. I'll upstage my partner here too, because he brought this up earlier, I think, on a local level. Bill Coles' departure, true gentleman, I think came very suddenly to everybody in the news business here, and we'll miss him.
Will have a great impact on the local area.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you bet it will.
Steve Sheen.
Well, Tony, these may be the toughest show I've ever had to do. I can hardly remember what happened at breakfast this morning, let alone think back on the entire year. So I'm going to jump to the obvious question and ask each of you, or you could even huddle if you like, and come up with a consensus opinion to name the top national story and the top local story of 1992 for me.
Top national has got to be Bill Clinton's election. I mean, who could have foreseen that? As we were talking before the show aired, here in North Idaho, the Democrats rated him a tie for third with Jerry Brown among when they were caucusing. Number one was Tom Hartkin. Number two was Paul Tsongas. And then there was this guy named Bill Clinton from Arkansas with, some folks think a very liberal fringe candidate, Jerry Brown, ex-California governor. And to watch him progress through the polls all the way to the presidency, it was incredible. I didn't believe it until the very end. You just don't go against Weekly Reader. And they chose President Bush. So it was an incredible campaign. If he can serve as president as incredibly as he campaigned, we have an extraordinary man here.
Before you name your local story, David Bond, do you have a different opinion, or are you going to?
I'm going to have to get behind DF on this one, without a doubt. Bill Clinton's ascension.
I couldn't start an argument if I suggested that maybe the decline and fall of George Bush is from an incredibly high approval rating.
That was last year's big story.
All right, I can't. We got an agreement there. All right, Mr. Oliveira, how about the top local story then?
Top local story. This one's difficult because it depends on which side you're coming down on. Politically, I think the 1% Initiative has got to be way up there because it riveted attention from both political parties. From folks that are fed up with increasing property values and taxes. Everyone was aware of it. I think that a lot of money was spent to defeat it, and that could have, one of the ripple effects might have been hurt the Democratic Party. If you're talking about the top story, you'd have to put the Randy Weaver siege. If you're talking about top non-political story, it would have to be in there extremely high.
He's taken two, which really wasn't fair.
That's right.
Any other?
Well, I'll concur on the Weaver story as far as just pizzazz goes, and I think that kind of dissolves into a larger what is the federal government doing in this part of the world story. Let's throw the Frank Sinkovich. Again, we're both bringing an Idaho perspective here, but the sheriff of Shoshone County recently tried and neither convicted nor acquitted by a hung jury for racketeering and various other things in Shoshone County. Again, the target of a massive, elaborate, expensive, and as yet ill-defined project on the part of the federal government to take poker machines out of bars in rural Shoshone County, Idaho. That certainly, for sex appeal, that's the story, and I think we'll be wondering about that for years. I think the unspoken.
Are you on a soapbox here?
Yes, I'm on a soapbox. The other story, it never gets the headlines. It's back on the business pages or the regional section, is this phenomenal growth that we've had here. You read about it every time a shopping mall opens. An anti-California bumper sticker goes on the back of an old pickup truck. Hunting pressures in increasingly urban lands, demand for infrastructure, real estate values, blah, 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 blah. That story goes on daily here, and that's the big one.
Well, it's interesting. Real estate values in the last quarter of 1991, Spokane was the highest in the nation in terms of an increase for that quarter, 19%. And they didn't survey the Coeur d'Alene market, but we're extremely parallel. So that's where we're standing right now.
I want to do two things before I go back to the panel. And the first one's going to be a personal thing for both of you, and I will start with David Bond. You both are prominent writers in your papers, and as I indicated at the beginning of the show, you've been around and done stories a long time and are veterans of this process, and so you have expertise to draw on this question. David Bond, for the 12 months of 1992, I have a two-part question. One is, what do you think was the most important story you covered, and also which one was the most rewarding to you?
All right. Well, let's start with a caveat, Tony. I came late into the year. This year I was up in Alaska the first 6 months out of the year. The most rewarding for me, and I think one that's going to bear some following up on, is this federal audit of what how some of the Idaho State monies have been spent on the Bunker Hill Superfund project. It's the biggest cleanup project in the country. We got some serious oversight on it finally this year with an inspector general audit, and they found some discrepancies, 6 bits on every dollar, basically. That was an interesting story to uncover and to more or less to wing alone, with everybody else in the media kind of scratching their heads, and I'm gonna, we'll stay on top of that. I think it will make some statements about how well the state did with the money and how tough Dana Rasmussen is and how bad she wants to keep her job as Region 10 administrator for EPA.
What was the most interesting thing you did, or enjoyable?
Oh, enjoyable. It's a tough one. Probably the same, just because it's a very complicated topic.
Thank you. DF?
I think the biggest story, again, I covered the 1% initiative from its birth right after the passage of Truth in Taxation in 1991, legislation which sort of removed the old property tax cap. What's incredible to me is watching the forces build up against Rankin, Ron Rankin, and his property owners, members. Rankin reminds me sort of the Duracell rabbit. Just when you think he's beat, he gets up and keeps going. So it's going to be very interesting now that the 1%'s been defeated. It's back. The battle lines are already starting to get drawn again. With Mary Lou Reed has already come out with some proposed legislation that would require initiatives to get the okay of the Attorney General, or at least the blessing before they move on. So already the battle lines are getting drawn 2 years ahead of time. That's to me is I think the biggest story, watching it come back, that I've covered. The most interesting story, I think, was the state line prostitution bust, just because I cover local government. That means sewers, that means roads, that means whatever, all those boring things that are important to you, but I put under the category DBI, dull but important. And so to have something like a huge prostitution bust to get me out of that mold was extremely interesting. I go from teaching Sunday school at a Baptist church on Sunday to talking to prostitutes on Monday, and that's real interesting. And my wife, yeah, she makes sure I get deprogrammed in those situations.
Reporters' lives are really varied in what they cover. My second question is in the international arena. I've been looking at some of the stories that took place in 1992, and it's like you've done a really, really fine job of identifying some of the really important questions domestically. And internationally, it's equally as difficult. I will just trigger a couple of ideas. One is that after from a previous year, after what happened in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, the continual disintegration now of some of the Eastern European countries is one story, and certainly maybe not the same kind of attention of the people, but the Rio Conference on the environment in the world was a first in that sense, and I just use those as kind of examples, but I'm trying to get your viewpoint. And DF, I'll start with you again this time. What would you consider probably the most important development internationally that will in the long run affect this planet?
Well, I think you've really hit on one as to what becomes of the Soviet Union and its former pawns or allies, or however you want to address that. It just seems like with the disintegration, someone major has to step onto the scene to bring that all back together, or we're going to be providing a lot of aid and a lot of military aid to a lot of countries for a long time.
David Bond.
Well, being behind Dave, I'll have to concur with his opinion. Whither go the Commonwealth of Independent States, the next 12 months, 12 years is going to have a big bearing on us. I think George Bush boogered a really good opportunity to extend international goodwill, help get that country back on its feet. They've disintegrated into kind of a civil war situation. Although you can watch McNeil Lehrer one night and then the following night and get two completely different economists' points of view on how well or how poorly their version of capitalism or non-capitalism is succeeding. But I think desperately they need our help. And if we just sort of stand back and watch it collapse, we're going to pay the consequences.
And it has all kind of consequences. One of the just quick comment for you, or suggested comment, would be that if you go back in history into the 1800s, even more so in the 1700s and further back than that, there was such a small countries in Europe, and so many of them, and there was this balance of power, and Great Britain played that balancing role. Do you see with the ethnic divisiveness in Eastern Europe that we might be headed, not in Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, into a lot of small countries?
Well, we could well be. You have to certainly give the iron hand of totalitarian rule over there for 90 years almost great credit in holding those. Those folks just flat don't get along. In holding those tribes and those religious groups together. What goes on from here with a decentralized government? Yeah, I think you're going to have a shaking out. But if you look at what Western Europe even was like at the end of World War II, we bought an awful lot of goodwill with the Marshall Plan and built a heck of an industrial engine there, and I think the same could be accomplished.
Well, it's real interesting. As you look around the world, not just to Eastern Europe, you think of all the different countries that are falling apart or engaged in some type of civil unrest. Just to the south of former Soviet Union, you still have a powder keg. So you wonder if we were to advance this 12 months, would we be talking about another explosion in between the Arabs and the Israelis? So I just think you really have a real tender situation all through that part of the world.
The world's so changed. 3 or 4 years ago, if someone announced on this program that the Soviet Union would not be any longer, they'd probably been escorted to an institution. So that's how fast things change.
Yeah.
Janelle Burke.
Some people have said that 1992 was the year of the woman. Let's start with David Bond. Do you think that it was the year of the woman, and did that have any local repercussions?
Well, if you count 5% representation now in the United States Senate as a big gain for women, which unfortunately it is, then certainly 92 was the year of the woman. Patty Murray in Washington, Boxer and Feinstein in California. I think the construction of a woman's restroom in the United States Senate is a real, probably the singular development this year. Along that line, what remains to be seen, I think we're going to have to judge that question retrospectively. Is a woman's agenda carried forward in the Congress, or is Congress going to have the money, or to broaden entitlements, or to say pay us in the IRA, and all the attendant costs that come with that. I certainly think that the Clarence Thomas debacle a year ago helped bring about an awareness that there is a woman's side of things in a big way.
Any comment?
Well, it's going to be real interesting this next year of watching Hillary Clinton because she has become I think the leader of the women's movement just by the position she will be in next year. So to watch her and to watch how she navigates shark-infested waters, because there's already a perception out there, it would be very easy for her to make a lot of mistakes, and it'd be it'd be difficult, but she could also lead the women's movement a long ways too.
Now, this was also the year of the Olympics, and we had some locals who were involved in Olympic competition. Starting with you, DF, what do you think happened with regard to the Olympics nationally? Was it a great
Dream team
feeling of
the dream
wonder?
team was. It was really interesting to just gauge my own reactions to this team of giants. The giants playing against elementary school kids. There was a pride there. As they were beating everybody up by 60 points. Some of the teams, even Croatia, I'm still struggling with some of these countries. They thought it was just an honor to be on the court with the dream team, and there was goodwill. This is the last time we'll ever see the former Soviet countries under one flag, and they participated under the flag of the unified team. But I think there's a lot of goodwill out of the games. You no longer were angry at the Soviet Union because you sort of felt sorry for them. Some of the tales that they were being told of how they got there, I think the Americans just really have a tendency to have, our heart goes out to those type of situations.
David Bond, any comments on the Olympics?
Well, you're asking a guy that never turns on ESPN, but it was a year that it was sort of politically acceptable to root for the Russians. I mean, they were the underdogs. They weren't these great big steroid, hyped up, scary machines anymore. They were a little bit pathetic with the, stitch marks where USSR used to be, and some kind of new label slapped on their uniforms, and I don't know. It was certainly, as Dave said, an unprecedented year of goodwill in the Olympics.
There was a continuing story off that dream team and out of the Olympics, and that's Magic Johnson and his battle with AIDS. There was a little bit of a discussion: do we want him on the team among some of the other players? There was a real fear of coming in contact with him and possible accident, contracting AIDS. And despite all the education, even among people of that level, they still were wary. Then Magic Johnson continues on and tries to resurrect his career, is going along, doing fairly well, and decides, because of the undercurrent of the backlash against him from the other teams, decides to retire again.
He has one slam dunk shot left for George Bush.
Right.
The end of that.
Yeah. But that was an extension of the Olympics.
Steve Sheen.
Dave Oliveri, you mentioned just a second ago continuing stories. If we got back together this time next year, do you think there are any of this year's top stories that will make that list again next year? And last time I asked a question, I gave you, Dave Oliveri, the chance to start. How about you, David Bond?
Okay. Well, I think a year from now, we'll all be talking about the deficit. We talked about it briefly during Ross Perot's campaign. He made it an issue in 1992. In 1993, it won't need Ross Perot. Looks like the indicators last part of 92, going into the new year, suggest a recovery. Been a lot of cash laying around. Business hasn't needed it for expansion. You're going to see the private sector move into borrowing in 1993. You're going to see a competition for capital, an uptick or two in the interest rates, and the government will, the deficit, both the deficit and the debt will increase as we devote larger and larger chunks of our income to servicing that debt. And that will be a story that that's going to start forcing choices on us in 1993.
Dave Oliveri, do you see any stories carrying forward into the next year and staying big?
Well, there's a story that I think is fairly frightening, and that's crime. Crime is starting. It used to be something that you could just for your own personal well-being and feeling good about things, that you could always say that it was the big city problem. It was a California problem, New York problem, anywhere but North Idaho. And now we're seeing such bizarre things in our own backyard that I think we're losing a little bit of that peace and safety feeling here. What's going to be some of the nonsense we're going to see next year? We're seeing very common things where you just don't feel safe anymore, and this is here in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. It's starting to come into it's crossing the border from Spokane over into Coeur d'Alene now.
There are some stories that seem to be with us every year. They don't go away for a very long time, and I certainly would put on that list, and Ross Perot had something to do with this, and others, and of course the families, and that's the MIA story. And David Bond, I would start with you. Do you think that is going to be resolved in '93, or are we going to, a year from now, be talking about, again, the whole question that MIA continues to be with us, the question from the Vietnam War?
Well, the Vietnam War will always be with us, but I think the MIA question is about resolved. The suggestion was made that George Bush, before he leaves office, should normalize relations with Vietnam, and Bill Clinton should pardon Caspar Weinberger and cross that over. The Vietnamese have really got nothing to gain by keeping us in the dark anymore on the MIA question.
And at this point, they can blame other guys for being in leadership in those days.
Exactly. We're going to have fraud artists come forward with doctored pictures and torture the hearts and minds of the families of these people. But in terms of hard physical evidence, in terms of new revelations, in terms of ongoing concern, I think we're done with that issue.
DF, on another issue that an era came to an end too in 1992, and an institution in television, and that was Johnny Carson. I think that is a significant thing to recognize. Would you like to react to that announcement?
I'm sort of like Dave on this one. I was not a big Johnny Carson follower, although of course you'd have to be, have your head in the sand not to realize what he meant to the business. 30 years of that show, he spawned all kinds of copycats, and some extremely good ones like David Letterman, Arsenio Hall. I'm sort of like, I'm usually watching ESPN Sports at that time of the night. So I might have to defer to Dave on this one.
David, would you like to?
Well, I just get out of that, maybe the death of Jay Leno is certainly going to be, I think, one of the shortest-lived celebrity careers. My prediction this time next year, somebody other than Jay Leno will be hosting The Tonight Show.
One final question. I got the cue. We're about out of time. Either one of you or both of you would like to answer it. Always on this show, we take a look too at deaths during the year. Who was the person that we lost probably that was you would consider most prominent as far as contributions to society?
Well, I'll have to sneak back, not only because it's our newspaper, but in this region, Bill Coles would have to be number one. He was, I've been in this business 23 years, and there are two publishers that I have a great deal of respect for, and he was certainly way up there. The Lewiston Tribune, Butch Alford was the other one that I just thought the world of. I spent the first 10 years of my career working for these small newspapers.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to wrap. I got the signal we're out of time. Thank you both, gentlemen. It's been a really informative show. I think we've covered more topics this year than ever on our New Year's program. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll remind you, too, that we tape this program on December the 3rd, and so if a story develops before January, it's not the fault of our guests for not knowing about that. I hope you'll be with us again next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.